Hello, everybody. My name is Ken Coates. I'm a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Delighted to be with you here today. And we apologize for the fact we had to reschedule this. So thank you for your patience in finding us. I hope you're going to enjoy the conversation together. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Karen Restoule, who's our newest senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Karen may just about be one of my favorite people in the country. She's absolutely fabulous. She's got a huge background that goes all over the place. She's worked on Indigenous economic issues, worked on self-government, worked on Indigenous women's issues, family issues. She's a public affairs professional. She's got a wonderful, wonderful background involved. She's right now a vice president with Crestview Strategy, but she's worked with the Chiefs of Ontario. She's with a whole bunch of not-for-profit organizations. This is tireless in sort of moving Indigenous opportunities forward and supporting Indigenous rights and situations anywhere in the country. So, Karen, I'm going to give you a chance to say hello really quickly, but I'll just tell everybody the format today. We have received about 15 questions from people before the seminar. They're wonderful questions. I've got a bunch of questions that Karen and I put together, but we're going to take turns doing this. So this is not an interview. It's a conversation. It's a conversation we started about 5 or 6 months ago. It's been incredibly powerful and wonderful for me. And we're going to continue after this webinar. So this is one webinar on a very general topic to introduce you to Karen, introduce you to what we're doing. We're going to come back on specific topics in the future. Hope you'll join us for those as we go along. And the only other thing I'll say is that two things. One is on your chat, you can actually send in messages to us. And if we have time, we'll get to them. If not, we may use them for future conversations. So if you come listening to us and think, boy, I want to hear an hour's worth on that topic, then put it in there and we'll put it in our sort of planning process. Last thing, we appreciate your time and we respect your time. So we will be stopping precisely at the top of the hour. We're the bottom of the hour. I'm trying to figure out where we are. I'm calling in from the Yukon today. Karen is Ontario. Karen, quick hello to you.
Pleasure to join you, Ken, for this webinar, and the team at MLI. I've long admired the work that you have done, and it's an honor to be able to contribute to strengthening the bench there at MLI. I'm very excited and very much excited about today's conversation. I know you and I kicked off in June on stage. It was, I barely felt like I was, in the limelight. It felt like we were just sitting and leaning back and having a conversation about all the exciting parts and the challenges that remain facing First Nations in today's world. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation with you and the others. And please don't hesitate to send your questions in while we have our chat.
Fantastic. So I'm going to put you on the spot in the very first instance. And this is a very strange one for MLI. We usually do this as an interview format. And I'm going to ask a question, and Karen's going to ask the next one. And who knows where it's going to go? Because we've got an hour. We want to use it effectively. We want to get you excited. We want to get you concerned. We want to get you motivated. We want to get you angry at times. There are some things that are going extremely well. So let's start with this one, Karen. We hear all sorts of reports coming out. Now people are paying attention to what they call the Indigenous economy, reports by the World Bank and reports by different organizations saying, oh, good things are happening. Is the Indigenous economy at a tipping point? Are we actually finally seeing that transition from sort of basically a welfare-dependent economy, reserve-based, to a more active, engaged, and more profitable economy?
Yeah, I would say that that we're at a very exciting moment in time. It's a really great time to be alive. The way I see it is that First Nations communities are on the verge of a pretty substantive economic shift. If you want to call it a tipping point, sure, we'll call it that. I would say that we're right in the middle of things right now. We have a combination of legal victories over the course of the last 30, 40, 50 years that have been issued by the Supreme Court that have kind of like pushed industry and pushed the Crown in this direction. We are having a lot of new investments and policy shifts that are all contributing to increased growth, and I would say even increased economic autonomy that is really helping to reshape the economic landscape of First Nations, Indigenous communities across the country, but Canada writ large. So it's really exciting.
So it's really interesting too, because for the very first time, I think people outside the Indigenous community are sharing that excitement. You and I have been watching this as it evolves over the last little while, and there's not very many advantages to being my age, but one of them is you sort of go back into the 1970s and 1980s and realize that people were buying a gas station, buying a six-room hotel, and the government of Canada was putting us on the front page of the Department of Indian Affairs, as it then calls sort of the annual report. So, oh, look at this entrepreneurship. And the thing that bothers me, Karen, about that, and I'm really interested in your thoughts on this, is that Indigenous people have been economic from the very beginning. Like long before the Europeans arrived, we've got evidence of trade connections between. I live on the prairies now. Trade connections between Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the Gulf of Mexico. Trade connections in the Arctic Ocean and way deep into the interior, from the Pacific coast. Trails. The coast called grease trails that went from the coast into the interior. So we get this idea that filters out there that I think we have to sort of really shut down. That somehow Indigenous economic engagement is a new thing, and that finally they've learned what white people have known for such a long time, that they have to work hard to make money and blah 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 blah. So how do you respond to that?
I would say that non-Indigenous people have to shift out of that paternalistic thinking. Right? There's often a lot of focus on First Nations saying, oh, like you're always kind of pointing to the government to solve your problems. Well, in fact, I think non-Indigenous Canadians also have to reshape and review the way that they look at us and the way that we live together here on these lands. On your point about how long we've been here, like my story surprises people when I tell it. Quite often I'll take advantage of a longer introduction when I'm invited to speak. We've long been successful in trade and business in our territory. It dates back to the fur trade. I mean, at least the stories that have trickled down to me, I'm sure they extend far beyond that. My chief will often tell the story about how we almost put Hudson's Bay out of business. Talk about making some enemies there because we were so sharp and competitive in the fur market for trade. And so from there, we went on to timber, really looking around within our territory and seeing what was possible. And it was at a time, I like to emphasize this, it was at a time where we were under the thumb of Ottawa. There was a literal Indian agent in our community telling us what we could and couldn't do. But the stories are that we actually made friends with our Indian agent. And we brought them along the journey, and we were able, because of those positive relationships that we prioritized, we were able to kind of get things moving at the community level. And when I say investment in the relationship, I heard there was a party or two that happened back then. So you do what you got to do to get business rolling, right? But to your point, like my community is not unique. I think by and large, mainstream media has done us a disservice here in Canada. They've focused largely on the social issues that are remnants of or a creation of the Indian Act. And it's not to say that it's not important to highlight those and to ensure that Canadians understand and know that, this is a reality for a lot of our people. But why can't we tell the good stories? I've been told time and time again, when I run into a journalist at a party who goes, yeah, but nobody cares about the good news. And I was like, well, they should, right? They should. Miss and Abby Cree investing with Ellis Dawn in a seniors rental residential unit in downtown Toronto. That's a good news story. Everyone should want to hear about that. Not only are they going into business and really putting the stamp on economic reconciliation, they're helping to meet a Canadian need right now, which is housing. So a lot happening there. And I'm with you. We've been around a long time. I think the restraints of the red tape, the Indian Act, is just loosening a little more. And the boldness and competitiveness of my people is coming out, I would say.
It really is, Karen. I mean, and all across the country. And I think it's really important for us to realize how long and deep those traditions of economic activity were. You look at the lower mainland of British Columbia and the Vancouver Island area. This is actually the most densely settled non-agricultural place in the world. And it's not a perception people have. Southern Ontario actually was very densely settled. It had a lot of people. They moved their homes from season to season and year to year because they were using the soil in particular ways. But the idea that sort of Europeans came along and taught them everything is just so offensive. But I'm going to throw something back at you. And this is a bug of mine that I all the time. We always talk about, we used to call it the Indian problem, and now we sort of talk about the Indigenous problem, and we problematize Aboriginal people. And then we talk about capacity. So the Indigenous communities don't have capacity, which is mean, send them all to college, send them all to university. I'm going to put this to you. The biggest problem in Canada is the non-Indigenous misunderstanding of Indigenous societies, not the other way around. Indigenous people actually know the dominant society inside and out, don't like it very much sometimes, but they know it inside and out. And the biggest capacity problem is not there are issues where you don't have enough mechanics or you don't have somebody to run the water filtration system. Those are real things. But the biggest capacity problem is within government and within corporations, having people who truly understand, welcome, and participate with Indigenous people, and do so as friends and as colleagues and what have you. That the problem and the capacity, the general problem and the capacity problem are maybe exactly the reverse of what everybody thinks. What do you think about that?
I would say that my dad is one of the smartest people, like female and male, that I've ever met in my life. He had a high school degree. I think he would have done maybe a few months of university and then chose to go back home and work in the bush with my uncles in the timber trade and logging. And I think it's a question of like, what do you qualify as smart? Right? Is it really the letters next to your name? Does that suddenly make you superior and more apt to be able to navigate the world?
Yeah.
I'm from a place where it's not about the letters next to your name. It's about a curiosity about the environment around you. Are you inquisitive? Are you truly interested? Are you taking the time to pause and learn about every experience that you're faced with? And so I actually think that where I'm from, there's a ton more common sense and pragmatism than I experience when I'm here in the city. And in the city, I'm surrounded with a lot of people with fancy degrees and whatnot who couldn't probably tie a shoelace today because, they have slide-in shoes now. I'm exaggerating, but you get my point, is that I think in the cities, in the world of academia, we often get lost in terms of, what it means to be a lifelong learner and what it means to be an academic expert.
Interesting. I'll just let you know, let the audience know, I have three of those fancy university degrees, and I'm so old that I can't tie my shoelaces, so I use slip-in shoes. So I'll try really hard not to take your condemnation in a very personal sort of way. And I don't actually. I think it's actually really a very fair arrangement. And just I'll do one sort of shift over to the political side to get your thoughts on this. Personally, I think the hardest job in Canada is to be a First Nations chief. That there's actually nothing harder than that. They have to deal, because those social issues are real. And part of the reason there's such a motivation for economic development is to get the wherewithal to sort of address those at the local level and do it by themselves, right? But you think of what an average chief has to do. They're involved with constitutional affairs. They have maybe 2 or 3 legal cases going forward that could easily cost their community $1 million or $5 million or $10 million, right? They're doing economic development. They're dealing relationships with the local municipality, with the provincial government. They're building a social welfare system. They're moving toward Aboriginal self-government. How do First Nation chiefs do it? I mean, there's a huge burnout.
You forgot there, Ken, that they're also mopping the floor after the community event. They're also getting calls to go unclog a toilet from a citizen at 11 o'clock at night. And then the next moment, the next morning, they're shaking hands with the minister and cutting some sort of deal. Like they really do it all. And they have, I like to say it's like a prime minister, a premier, a mayor, all mixed into one, plus your unelected leader. Like it's just, it really is a challenge. But if I can bring us to what I've seen in turn, or what we would have seen in terms of growth on the economic side, back in 2016, when I was preparing a talk, I found a number there somewhere in the shuffle that there were 167 of the 634 First Nations that were involved in some sort of resource development project in their territory. Recently, I dug around and I found another data point, and it's very challenging because no one's really collecting this formally, which is fine. I believe in data, sovereignty and that, but at the same time, it would be very helpful for us to kind of understand where the shifts and trends are at. But nonetheless, the most recent data I found is that it's just over 60% now today of First Nations who are involved. And that's a pretty significant jump in an 8-year period. So when you talk about, leaders at the community level, how smart are they, and are they well equipped to lead? I would say, looking at those numbers, the results do all the talking, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't want to look at federal government's performance numbers. We know that the Parliamentary Budget Officer issued a report a couple of years ago looking at Indigenous Affairs departments to see whether or not they were delivering on their mandates, and he gave them a failing grade. Ick.
Yep.
And yet here we are in 8 years. You have an incredible shift in the numbers of First Nations who are undertaking these huge projects and really positioning their communities for advancement. So I think, what is that? The proof is in the pudding. I'm sure there's all sorts of other expressions that we can use. But things are happening, and they're moving in the right direction. Tangibly.
I always use the example of the fishery on the East Coast, Mi'kmaq fishery, where Donald Marshall Jr. goes to court over fishing for elvers, for eels, and wins a court battle. And you think, well, what's going to happen now? Well, the government had no plan. They weren't what they were. Didn't have a strategy for going forward. Put one together on the fly over the next couple of years. You now have over 1,000 Indigenous people who are directly employed in that industry. You now have the Member 2 First Nation, along with other First Nation partners, purchase Clearwater Seafoods. It's $1 billion seafood company. It's the largest seafood company in the country. And Chief Terrence Paul, who's like your father, he's a brilliant guy. He's super smart, and he's building convention centers. He's got hotels, restaurants. He's got the Tim Hortons on his reserve. All this really great stuff. I remember asking him one time, so what are you going to do with this? What do you now own? The dog caught its tail, right? You now own the Clearwater Seafoods. And he said, from my view, and he's talking about himself, it is a platform that all First Nations in the East can use to reach the global economy. So you've got their marketing division, you've got the research plans, you've got the processing plans. You can use that to take whatever idea you want and try to bring it forward. That doesn't sound like other companies. Is there something? Indigenous companies don't seem to work the same way as a regular company. They do focus on profit, but I'm really interested in your thoughts on that. I mean, is Indigenous business a different thing than just business?
I've been thinking a lot about this. I've been in a lot of rooms in the last couple of years where there's a lot of talk about the relational approach that First Nations take. And to me, I'm like, it makes me question, like, how is mainstream business doing business? Like, do they not talk to each other? Do they not share a meal? Do they not get to know one another? And so I find that, excuse me, quite puzzling. But again, I guess I'm biased because I'm Anishinaabe, and I grew up in this world where I've seen how the relational approach, to me, in my experience, is the way to go. But I do think that mainstream business would benefit from examining how First Nations like to do business, and how it truly is an engagement on the front end where you actually get to know one another and the principles that you stand for before you jump into the marriage, so to speak. So I think they'd be wise to take a cue.
So just to follow up on that, I love your observation, because I think it's absolutely right. And it doesn't mean that it's absolutely perfect and it works the same way all the time. And there are Indigenous businesses, a range of behaviors and a range of priorities and all that kind of stuff. But it does seem to me that we are seeing a way in which Indigenous business is changing the way Canadian business operates. And the number one place that is happening is actually in the resource sector. So, there are more than 400 agreements between mining companies and First Nations. That's an astonishing number. That doesn't include, the pipelines. It doesn't include the transmission lines. It doesn't include a whole bunch of other big agreements that are taking place in the natural resource sector. We're not seeing that happening in downtown Toronto, or are we? Are we seeing the sort of isn't it ironic? We think the resource sector are a bunch of people with a hard hat and a shovel going up there and sort of digging coal out of the ground and selling it to the Americans or selling it to Japan. It's one of the most sophisticated sectors of our economy. It's very high tech, but they're very good at these relationships. And so you hear of the presidents of Suncor and the presidents of Syncrude and the presidents of these major corporations getting out and meeting with the Indigenous communities. And when there's a death of a revered elder, they go to the funerals. It's a very different model. So are you seeing the same thing on the resource side? And I'm not seeing it in the cities. So tell me if there's something more going on that I haven't seen.
Yeah, I think it goes back. As you're talking, I thought about the time that I had the pleasure of moderating Ian Anderson and asking him about his work with TMX. You had quite a few First Nations there along the path, and who were largely opposed. And in comes Ian Anderson saying, "Hey, I think we need to actually prioritize talking to communities one-on-one." What an outrageous idea. Oh my goodness. Actually engaging directly and having a conversation with. And I think when you're in the rural and remote areas, it's really hard to be neighbors with someone and not talk to them or
Yes.
not meet up with them at the grocery store. But I find cities, the way they're set up, or I'm not sure, maybe it's even like the tone that leadership sets. I could be in Toronto in a condo and not ever meet the people that I share a wall with, or that who have a door 2, 3, 4 feet from my front door, which I find completely outrageous. That's not to say that in times of difficulty, I have seen Toronto, in power outages and whatnot, where people do come out and they do engage with their neighbor in a very, quintessential Canadian way. But I find at the remote and rural level that people are just more, I think, culturally situated to actually want to engage with one another.
And you can't avoid it in the sense that they're your only friends, your only neighbors, and you're going to have to work together. And they didn't in the past. You go back 50 years. A mine was a sort of an island unto itself. They built really fancy facilities for the mining community and nothing for the Indigenous community. The neat thing is we're seeing that change. And when the mine's coming in, they're hiring local folks. Two developments I want to just run by you because I find this really interesting. The Selkirk First Nation in the Yukon is a very small community based basically out of Pelly Crossing, a very small community. The Minto mine is actually on their settlement lands, and it closed down about a year and a half ago. They're now in the learning process of buying a mine, which I think it's kind of stuff that really shakes the foundations. Hold on a second, Indigenous people don't own the mine. Why would they do that? Well, there's a whole bunch of benefits the mine brought. The mine hired a bunch of people, hired a bunch of companies, actually paid for the water system in Pelly Crossing, I understand, or an upgrade of the water system. But they also look and say, well, the real profit in the mine is not in those things. It's actually owning the mine and getting all the things. So that's one. And the other one, the interesting thing about, neighbors and friends and relationships, the Nisga'a are proposing a pipeline. And this is really, this is like, wake up, everybody, this is happening. The Nisga'a not signing on to a pipeline. They're going to own the pipeline. And it goes to their territory. It's an LNG plant that will actually, a pipeline that will go through one of their communities where they're going to have a floating LNG plant. Their issue is they have relationships with the Gitxsan, who are the neighbors. So the Nisga'a have control over their own territory. They can do what they want, more or less. The Gitxsan are sort of, we're not so sure. And it's interesting watching because both communities are saying, we've got together to talk. And they're going to talk about we have to have ceremony. We have to get together in the right way, not just a sort of a meeting of business executives. Those strike me as really revolutionary things. This, to my mind, and because I've been around following this for a long time, you're looking and saying, even 10 years ago, we were talking about the idea that Indigenous people might buy some equity or get some equity in a pipeline. Well, now they're buying pipelines. They're $2.1 billion pipeline development with Enbridge in northern Alberta. So is this what I mean, or what you mean by the tipping point? I mean, is this the kind of stuff that is just shaking the foundations of the Canadian economy?
Yeah, just to rewind and go to your previous point about industry and how they're doing business. I think by and large, industry understands today that where they're kind of majority owners of a project and where they want to kind of set up business, they're operating on the principle of those who are most greatly impacted by the project stand to benefit the most. That's kind of like by and large the mentality I find when I'm engaging with industry folks. That's kind of how they're seeing it today, which I think is a huge step from where we were even 5 years ago, when one of our biggest conflicts kind of put the country at a standstill. And so that to me is very encouraging. But I agree with you. There's this concept of let's bring in a hockey reference. Wayne Gretzky is like, don't go where the puck is going. Don't stand there and look at the puck, and you got to go to where the puck is headed. And you just nailed it on the head. There's some really exciting leadership examples out there, and leaders who are bold enough to convince their communities to engage in big business decisions where they've done the work for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, investing in education in their community. You mentioned Chief Terry Paul of Member 2.
Yep.
They signed their own governance agreement on education 30 years ago. And the product of that is that they're now well positioned from a skills and experience perspective to be able to buy clear water. Same thing out west with the couple of examples that you've just mentioned. These are folks that have, in Niska's case, they would have signed out of the Indian Act and into their own governance agreement a long time ago, positioning themselves with a certain level of stability in order to be able to then venture out and go out and build a big business portfolio. And so I'm super excited about this and where this is headed. We're even, if you look in downtown Vancouver, we're even solving housing challenges for Canadians by building mass housing developments. And we're doing it in a quarter of the time because we don't have to deal with the jurisdictional nightmare and the red tape from Ottawa. And so it's really interesting because, certainly in my circles, there's some policy folks who's like, wait a minute, is life better within First Nations territories now? Like we thought we were getting it wrong. And it's like, well, actually there may be a little bit more autonomy there. But listen, I'm not promoting the Indian Act. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I would be keen, if every nation who wants to would be able to step out of it. But my point here is that once you kind of have that autonomy in hand with sound governance system, the sky's the limit, and that's certainly what we're seeing from coast to coast to coast.
That absolutely, and mine. I don't know the exact number, Karen, about how it shows up right now, but it's something like 100 First Nations are either out of the Indian Act because of modern treaties, or they're negotiating a way out of the Indian Act through self-government agreements. That's out of 636 or whatever across the country as a whole. And the main point you made, which I think is really important, is that it's up to the individual First Nation to decide if they want to do that. It isn't the government of Canada now decides this is a good way to go. The First Nations decide when they want to go. And you mentioned the housing projects in the Lower Mainland. Those are multi-billion-dollar projects. This is not building a condo unit with 12 units. This is 6,000 is one of the ones the Squamish are doing. It's 6,000 housing units, if I remember the number, or 6,000 people perhaps. I mean, these are staggeringly large projects. Remember 30 years ago, it was you build a gas station, open a gas station, or bought a hotel. And even on LNG, we have you mentioned, the TMX conflict that Ian Anderson did such a good job of sort of straightening out. And I'll say the same with the Coastal GasLink one. Now you have the Nisga'a proposing their own pipeline. You have the Squamish who are building and opening their own pipeline, and interest in their own LNG plant. And the neat thing there is actually, as I understand it, it's the first one where the Squamish First Nation used their approval process rather than the government of Canada's one. And they looked and said, this has to pass our bar, and our bar is higher than your bar. So why don't we use our bar instead of your bar? Let's not go through multiple processes. And you're now having an LNG plant built near Squamish. This is really quite astonishing. I'm a huge fan of the Haisla. And Ellis Ross was the previous chief councillor. Crystal Smith is the current chief councillor. These are remarkable entrepreneurs. And what they had to do, and I love what you said, Karen, because what they had to do was they had to build the community consensus around this first. Ellis Ross didn't start building hotels. Ellis Ross talked to communities about building jobs, building prosperity, building opportunity, and whatever. Crystal inherited that, and she's now, the Cedar LNG plant is a $5 billion project. And you're such a young person that for you, you're looking at this and this is kind of normal. Boy, for my generation, this is transformative kind of stuff. So listen,
it really is.
There's one place I want to get your thoughts on this. This is actually one of our audience members, Barb, asked this question. Around the country, we're getting all these notices of big settlements. Your community's involved with one. The Robinson Huron was a $10 billion settlement. Robinson Superior will come in due course. Some people think it'll be more. Some people think it'll be less, but it'll be a big one nonetheless. You have the cows and plows agreements on the prairies. Almost every week somebody says, and we just signed a $100 million deal with the federal government to honor a promise that was made in the 1870s. Don't want to pat the government on the back. It only took them 150 years to actually keep a promise that they made all that time ago. Billions of dollars are flowing into Indigenous communities. Is that going to accelerate economic development? This is Barb's question.
I think it depends on what the nations want to do with the settlement funds. There's some, it varies. We're not a monolith, right? And so I'd love to say, all Indigenous communities believe this and this is what they're going to do. It's just not. And I even see the differences in the 21 communities within Robinson Huron back at home and the discussions that took place. And you really do see the differences in principle and ideology, not stark differences. I would say we're all pretty much aligned, but, some communities wanting to take a bit more of a libertarian approach, really believing that 100% per capita distribution, that it truly be up to them as an individual to determine what that portion, what their share, what they should and want to do with their portion of the funds. And then you have some communities that are seeking balance where there is a per capita distribution to reflect the annual annuity component of that clause, right? People don't know. I grew up collecting 2 toonies from the government every year, which is when I tell that to, hey, I'm very popular at cocktail receptions and dinner parties when I tell this story. Okay. You literally line up and it was $2 bills. And then we got the loonies and toonies and you're lined up with your status card and you're literally all waiting to see the Indian affairs officials who are stationed to kind of like, you show them your card and there they go, 2 toonies. Thank you. This is your payment. This is your annuity payment for Robinson Huron Treaty beneficiary. And it's just wild to me. And it's wild to so many Canadians today who hear that story. And so all of that to say is that there is a collective and an individual component to the Robinson Huron Treaty, to the annuity case. And so most communities have opted to recognize that and reflect that within the distribution, with a portion of it going to to address the injustice of the $4 per year, which should be, I don't know, $3 or $4 or $5 grand per year. You're the economist. I don't know what the equivalent would be today, but and then investing it collectively. So the quick answer for Barb is that by and large, communities are making investments, parking those funds into trusts and designing them in a way that where those dollars can really be only exercised for the benefit of the community and the collective. So a lot of smart decision making happening across the country on this front.
And I point out something fairly obvious, and I'm sure you know this, is that they're showing an intelligence about this that the non-Indigenous population don't. We tried with the Alberta Heritage Fund a long, long time ago, and the idea was they put money aside. We didn't do it. We took all the money back out. Right, there's almost nothing in there. And Norway did exactly the opposite, and they put their money in there and said it has to stay there for the benefit of the country. They're now guaranteed to be one of the most prosperous nations on the planet for all time. If you want to see something funny, you go to Norway and look at where they invested their money. They're required by law to invest 80% of all their money outside of Norway. So they don't want to use it to explode the local economy. They want to use it to support the local economy. So they own things all over the place. And they're doing really, really well, right? We didn't do that. Canada's shortcomings. And the interesting thing is, most non-Indigenous people wouldn't do this. If there was a situation where you had a huge problem with a natural gas company or a sewer company, and they backed up the sewers in 1,000 communities, and it took us 25 years to get a settlement, and everybody's going to get $100,000, before the government didn't look after your sewage properly. You're all going to get $100,000. The chance of the non-Aboriginal people saying, I'm going to take half of that, and I'm going to put half of it in a community trust so our community builds its economy again. Not going to happen, right? The interesting thing there is not that it doesn't happen all the time. It's that it happens at all. That the Indigenous folks voluntarily, through voting processes, you've been part of those conversations. Those are incredibly intense conversations. You've got people where the individuals are not wealthy. They're quite poor people. We're living on transfer payments. Senior citizens who are getting $26,000 a year or $30,000 a year, they could use $120,000. They're voting to only take 60 and to put half of it back into the community. It shows you there's a different mentality there, which I think is really, really important.
There really is. Yeah. If I can actually say one thing about state capacity, and then I'm going to flip a question to you on why with these investments in economic growth, like why we're still talking about poverty. But before I go there, when we are talking about all of these projects happening, the housing projects, building pipelines and mines and owning businesses and, making it all happen in half of the time, we really have to consider maybe the stereotypes that many Canadians carry about First Nations leaders and First Nations people. And I think that particularly over the pandemic, it became very clear that Ottawa, the federal government, has a serious state capacity issue. They lack the fundamental skills and kind of gusto and initiative to deliver on the simplest mandates. And that really is concerning. We have felt it as First Nations people. We have felt, the lags of Ottawa for a long, long time. But I think the pandemic really kind of busted up the top for all Canadians to see how state capacity is suffering in Ottawa. And so, shifting to my question for you, because we're going to mix up the format, and I get to ask you questions as well. We talk about economic growth, but there are so many stories about poverty, about lacking critical infrastructure. What's happening there? How should we be looking at that? How do we reconcile that in today's world?
That's a great question. And I love your comment about state capacity, by the way. I was going to go back over that just a tiny bit. Because, in fact, I've heard people describe the current government approach, which is not that different from the previous one, is so extremely paternalistic. Ottawa still thinks it makes decisions. Well, stop that. The communities can make decisions. They'll make good ones, they'll make bad ones. Let them make decisions and take responsibility. And the delivery system in Ottawa, they're very good about announcing programs and then taking a very, very long time. The federal government announced in its budget back in March that it was going to set up an investment trust fund that, several $1 billion that Aboriginal people could use to invest in any sector. Initially, they were going to leave oil and gas out, but they actually were forced to sort of put that back in by the communities themselves. So apparently they just put up an ad for people to be on the board of directors. It's taken 6
I saw
months.
that.
It's just getting going. This is craziness, right? These are urgent issues, and they're urgent for the following reasons: that we have an expectation in non-Indigenous societies that, first off, if we say we're sorry, that deals with the issue. That we apologize for something, that everything's forgiven, and we can go on from there. That does not work. Doesn't. You have to show something. You can't just say you're sorry. You have to actually be sorry. You have to take responsibility and see things built. Secondly, you cannot take problems that were built up over more than a century and instantly turn them around so everything's fine. And I'll use an example from Northern Ontario, which is a really good case in point, where these are communities. If you look at 1960, the year 1960, and you're up there, Lake Nipigon, sort of in the far north, right? And maybe north of that, toward the Hudson's Bay area, James Bay area. The Aboriginal people were still hunting, fishing, and trapping. Their language was strong. They followed their seasonal movements as they previously did. Government sort of didn't have enough money to sort of do much about it, didn't know what to do anyway. So they sort of let this just happen. As Frank Oliver, Minister of Indian Affairs, said in 1904, they were best left as Indians because he couldn't think of an alternative. He couldn't think of how do you turn somebody out of northern, trapping area into a farmer. You can't do that. Or an industrial worker. You can't do that. So what they brought instead was they brought in the welfare state. And the welfare state has some benefits in the sense that you have a sort of guaranteed incomes through transfer payments and things like that. Somebody actually builds you a house. They don't build a very good house. They build a Southern Ontario house in the north. It doesn't work very well. But the government's at least there in a presence in your lives. In those communities, in less than 25 years, the language almost disappeared among young people. The hunting and fishing activity went down to almost zero. You actually broke up families. And the whole family structure started to change because a woman that had 3 children could get funding for herself, didn't have to be with a partner. And so you get a disruption of sort of social patterns and things of that nature. In no way can that be turned around in 1 year or 2 years or even 10 years or even 20 years. It's a multi-generational problem that will need multi-generational solutions. The thing that I would say almost the opposite than what you were sort of implying, and I don't know if you agree with me on this, I'm actually astonished at how quickly they're changing. And you can go into communities, Champagne-Atiac in the Yukon, the Tahltan in British Columbia. Take a look on the coast of British Columbia, the Housat. They've got really serious problems. They just declared an opioid epidemic. And they declared a state of emergency, right? And you look at that, and that's the story. The story was a Housat do this. There's a story also, they just bought a couple of resorts, and they now own and operate the resorts and the hotels all for themselves and their own profit. They're involved in fishing. They're commercial fishing. They're interested in fish farming, which is a controversial issue out there. They're interested in economic development generally. No, we focus on the opioid situation. The opioid crisis is a manifestation of 120 years of being brutalized. Not to be too polite about it. The situation is residential schools, huge problem there, but also Indian Act, Indian agents, the control, the welfare system, welfare state, incredibly disruptive. And why, in what world do we expect that, okay, you got a contract now and you got a forest in there, now everything's okay? Well, you have to deal with hurting people. And what I've seen that works, 2 things that work, and I don't know, I love your thoughts on this. Number 1 is Indigenous self-government. When they control the decisions for themselves, make their own decisions and things of that nature, and giving communities the resources to deal with the social challenges. That's why the family and child welfare process has taken so long. That's why there's a $50 billion settlement sort of pending, approval by the Assembly of First Nations. This is going to transform hundreds of communities because they'll actually finally be able to control things that until very recently involved non-Aboriginal people coming in, taking their children and putting them with non-Aboriginal children. So, those challenges are very, very real. And we have to be, understanding that it's going to take a long time. But actually, in my world, what I've seen is it's shorter than you think. So we think it's going to take 5 generations. And you look at some of these places that got involved, Fort Mackay First Nation, you probably know in Alberta, one of the highest per capita family incomes, $135,000 annual family income in that community. That wasn't where they were 30 years ago. and they're healthier. They've got cultural centers and cultural activities and educational programs. It's a long answer because this one really gets me agitated. Because
Yes.
these things aren't in opposition to each other. People aren't poor because they're getting involved in economic activity, and economic activity is not a panacea. It's not going to solve everything the next day, but I'll tell you, it does give the resources and opportunities. And we're seeing some interesting things. And I'll finish with one thought, Karen. I'm
Yeah, yeah,
really
yeah.
interested in your thoughts here on this one. I'm yapping too much. Sorry.
No, it's good. It's good.
But one of the things people should remember is that the reserves that are sort of the focus for Indigenous life now are artificial. Sometimes they're located on traditional territories, and sometimes they were located exactly where the First Nations wanted to be. Other times they weren't. They were put for administrative convenience. You can't stay up there at the end of the lake. That's way too far away. We want you to come down to the south end of the lake. It's close to the highway. We don't want to live down there. It doesn't matter. If you want a house, it's down here. If you want a school, it's down here. If you want your welfare payments, it's down here, right? So the reserves are sort of that artificial creation of government through treaty processes. And what's interesting is a very substantial number of communities are breaking away from that. And they're not talking about the reserve as the place where all the resources go. They say, we're going to support our people anywhere in our traditional territories, which could be hundreds of miles east, west, north, and south. And so it doesn't look like it. You look and say, oh, that reserve doesn't look so great. Yeah, but there's 150 people in Thunder Bay working on jobs that are actually supported by this community, and they're part of the community, and they come to our events and our ceremonies, and they're part of our political process. It's just a different world. And I think it's very exciting. So that's a long answer.
I know there's so much that you put out there. Picking up on the last point, I think you and I have chatted very briefly about the question, what would Canada look like today had the reserve system not been created, right?
Yeah.
When you think back to how the treaties, and one of the motivations there to sign treaty on the Crown side was to kind of create these parcels of land, ensure, contain people, get them out of the way to give way to Western expansion. Because by golly, those pesky Indians are not letting us do what we need to do, correct? And so I often, I do a lot of driving. That's what you do when you have business in the city and family and community commitments at home. Something that I often think about is like, what would that world look like today if we had to talk to one another? If we never had those boundaries, if we had to kind of mix and meld and engage. And I think BC, in a way, especially those regions where treaty wasn't signed, provide for an excellent example of that. And I think perhaps a theory, maybe that's why some of the communities that you've mentioned here today have been doing so well, right? They haven't had that looming restriction over them for generations and generations. Because this is another point that people don't recognize is like, the Indian Act, it governed our lives for the last 150 years. It continues to govern our lives today. But it's not so much like, well, what does it say, the clause by clause? Sure, a lot of bad things happen, but it's the essence of, the intent of, the policy objectives were. You grow up, a child is born, they're not reading the Indian Act at 2 years old. But as they grow into that world, they can feel and sense the restrictions that the policy has created time and time and time, and reinforced time and time again. And people don't recognize the impact on ideology and worldview that has created. And I think when I talk about getting out of the Indian Act, it's not just getting out of restriction 6.2 and this and that. It really is, restoring autonomy and communicating to people within the policy framework that you have the right to govern yourselves in a way that you once did prior to the imposition of the current framework. And so that's I don't think this competes your rant, but that's my rant for today.
Well, it's a great rant, and I think really important. What happens is people do go and look at the technicalities, and if people who are listening to this today want to get really upset about what's going on in Indigenous policy and what has always gone on, is take a look at the membership rules under the Indian Act, and look at the fact that if Karen is a First Nations person and Bill is a First Nations person, but if they got married, It depends on what kind of First Nation they are as to whether their children will have Indian status or not, or full status. Who's making these decisions? These are both people deeply embedded in community, and you get all this sort of irrational sort of processes sort of coming out. And what I think, and I'll put in a strong example on this, I think people misunderstand, you don't, but misunderstand the psychological, multi-generational psychological impact of the Indian Act. And it isn't the technical words. It is, in fact, that process and the power that's exercised. If you talk to people who work in the prisons, they will tell you that somebody who lives in the prison, say for 5 or 10 years, they become institutionalized. They as soon as you ring the bell, they get up and they go for breakfast. If you stop ringing the bell, they don't get up. They don't know what to do, right? They want somebody to tell them what to do. And in the Indigenous world, these reserves were kept very, very strong. And we forget that many communities, not the remote reserve areas, the remote communities, but the ones near towns, they had curfews into the 1960s, where Aboriginal people had to leave town. And guess where they put their reserves? On the sloppiest, swampiest piece of garbage real estate they could find. They wouldn't put them in the nice area. They put them in the bad area. And it's great. I'm a huge fan of my home community of Whitehorse. The reserve that was set up there before World War I, before World War II, was actually really literally on a swamp, or at the edge of a swamp, full of mosquitoes. And you had the community, and then you had the industrial area, and then you had Whitehorse. So to get to the reserve, you actually had to go through, oil refinery tankers and working warehouses and all that kind of stuff. So it's a long, complex story, but they moved the reserve from there up top the 2 Mile Hill to one of the nicest parts of the city. And they rebuilt the reserve in a sort of a proper location. And interestingly, the main thing that came out of that, Karen, that I find absolutely fascinating, they built the Elijah Smith School, and they had started having Indigenous language instruction. The non-Aboriginal people said, this is really neat. Can our kids go too? And that school and the reserve has become, is your point about getting to know each other, living sort of side by side and all that kind of stuff. So the school is this place of not assimilation, but and not even integration, but of contact, good and friendly.
Like coexistence.
In a good way, right? The two-row canoes, right? So going side by side and coming together, sort of once in a while. Karen, this has been absolutely wonderful. We got about 7 more minutes. So I've got questions for you. We got a whole bunch of questions that our people have asked. I'm going to tell the folks who asked these questions earlier, we're going to build these into our next round, because these are absolutely fabulous questions that I want to sort of ask about them. I'm going to take one question off of here, and then maybe you can ask one more question before we leave, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Timothy asked a couple of questions, and let's just go to the one. Timothy said, what is the biggest First Nations barrier to transforming the Indigenous economy today compared with 10 years ago? Like a lot of progress. So what's still there? What are the barriers that are still making the Indigenous economy grow more slowly than we would like?
Like, for me, it's the Indian Act. That's where, some people might say, policy around land and being able to borrow from banks to go into big business. But that to me is tinkering on the edges of the Indian Act. To me, I would hit it right in the butt and say that the Indian Act is the big guy that needs to go. And if you look at, I'll give you an example. I'm a huge fan of former chief of Tsawwassen. I never said the name right. Kim Baird. She's awesome. I think her story is phenomenal.
She's marvelous.
I like, as a person, she's kind, she's funny, she is so smart. But her work, is the result of her greatness, in that she had a vision to get the community out from the Indian Act and into a self-governing situation. She's quite honest with me about, some of the critics that she faced and continues to faces in and around, the type of agreement that she would have signed, the type of treaty. But nonetheless, to me, I'm like, yeah, you know what? If you're going to sit around and say you're going to wait around for full sovereignty, I don't know, I'm not a huge fan of like the all or nothing. Sometimes you got to have like the middle step to get yourself organized. But nonetheless, that's a conversation for another day. My point is, she gets her community out of the Indian Act, and within 10 years, last article I read, there's over $8 billion of capital invested in that community within 10 years. What were you doing 10 years ago? I remember, it feels like yesterday. In a snap of a finger, there's billions of dollars of capital invested in that community, and they're a thriving economic hub. And this is what I mean by getting out of the Indian Act. You know, people are like, oh, it's so complicated. It's like, no, people are doing it. People have done it,
Yep.
and it's working really well. It's not perfect. The James Bay Cree will tell you it's not perfect. They go back to the negotiation table on their modern treaty all the time. And they're like, we want to tinker. We want to make it better. And is that a bad thing? No, it's not. Let's get back to the table. Let's keep talking to each other and making things better. Anyway, all of that to say, Tsawwassen is an awesome example. The Indian Act, you know, of building beyond the Indian Act, and contributing to their own economic wealth.
My parents used to live in Tsawwassen, and they moved there in the 1970s, and the transformation, not over that long period of time, has been unbelievable. But I certainly support what you said about Kim. Former Chief Kim Baird is remarkable. She's sort of Karen Restoule on the West Coast, and she's an amazing human being. And watching that, the interesting thing about that community is that if you drive by there, it's on the way to the ferry in Tsawwassen. You drive by, and it's a huge, big shopping complex, one of the largest shopping malls in the Lower Mainland. Thousands of cars there at any given time. Lots of investment actually in the port. They're involved with the port. They've houses for their own community, basically full employment, full training programs. They've done everything smart. It's a very different thing to do that in an urban area than it is to do it in a rural area. So if you're in Northern Ontario, north of Lake Superior, you can't do this. That opportunity isn't there. But to use another example from Saskatchewan that I think is a really good example, there are, I think the number is now 18, either completed or under negotiation, urban reserves. So remote communities have actually purchased a piece of land or secured it through their treaty land entitlement using that money, and they bought a chunk of land and they've built economic opportunity. You say, well, isn't that nice? Maybe they built a gas station. Nonsense. If you take a look at the Muskeg First Nation, they actually get something like $10 million a year in direct benefits going back from the operation of their reserve, which has 800 Indigenous people working on it, dozens and dozens of companies. The community, which actually from the government gets about $2.5 million a year, gets $10 million a year that they're able to use and spend any way they want. And so I would sort of, going back to Timothy's question and just wrapping it up, because this has been an amazing conversation. I completely agree about the Indian Act, but I think we also need to look at the other side of it, and that is that the bureaucracy is stifling Indigenous opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at I would love to see the minister's desk, because the joke is always that it's on the minister's desk. Well, if it was, the desk would have to be about maybe a mile wide, right? There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of files, quote, sitting on the minister's desk.
Yeah.
Bureaucracy moves way too slowly. Opportunities are lost. People get a grant in the budget that says you can build 5 homes. But actually, you had to know the previous November in order to order the wood, because you have to bring the wood in by barge. You can't know in March unless you're going to build it now a year and a half later, right? Bureaucracy has to be completely transformed. So self-government is not about your own decision-making. It's about getting out from the controls of the government of Canada and administrative and programmatic controls. And to give the federal government their credit, they are signing 5-year deals and 10-year deals with individual First Nations and saying, here's your budget, use it as you want. It's a global budget. It isn't a program by program budget. Karen Restoule, you are marvelous. This has been a fantastic, fantastic conversation.
It's a lot of fun.
It is good. And for the folks of you who are participating and put in questions in the chat, and those of you who asked a whole bunch of wonderful questions, unfortunately, we got talking and we went over too far. But we're going to go back and look over your questions and build them back in. We're going to do this about once a month. I hope you'll find them as pleasant and enjoyable as we did. So on behalf of Macdonald-Laurier Institute, on behalf of Karen and myself, Karen, you want to say goodbye?
It was a pleasure. Thanks for all your questions, and I look forward to the conversation continuing in the months to come. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. We'll close off now.